And now, somehow when you spoke about the simple vow of not having bottled water, that really appealed. And we look forward to some more simple directives from Professor Richard Cohen. He spent a couple of years in a village in Rajasthan, so really hands-on experience and inspiration. Went on to study at the Maharaj Sayaji Rao University, where his interest in literature, languages, and cultures of South Asia developed. And then, of course, he specialized in classical and medieval languages of Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsa. And he has administered South Asian centers at several universities. And besides that, he's developed an interest and specialization in Jainism through his work in Prakrit and Apabhramsa. He's also intrigued by the early South Asian Sufism through the study of its literature. Ladies and gentlemen, we present to you Professor Richard Cohen.
Thank you. Is this working? This one is working? Right. They're not going to conflict? Okay. First of all, I'd like to... Is it working, the microphone? Okay. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the conveners of the Anuvrat Samroha for inviting me, and also I'd like to convey my respects to Acharya Maha Shramanji for being a proactive leader for the Theravada. It's no accident that every Muni who comes and speaks here, before he says anything, he states his obeisance to the Acharya. And this is actually a very powerful idea. It is the starting point, if you will, of the Theravada Sampradaya, which goes back to the late 18th century, when Acharya Bhikshu ji realized that Munis were sort of not following strictly some of the rules that Munis should be following, and that they were going off and trying to form new groups. So he decided that the Acharya had to be the central figure in the Sampradaya, and to whom every other Muni would show their obeisance to and following. It is for this reason that the Sampradaya is so strong today, and that it has benefited from the personality of such leaders as Acharya Tulsi ji. And another important element in all of this structure is that there are if you think about it, there are very few religious organizations around the world, and specifically, I would say, in India, that have not given themselves over to a hereditary leadership rule. I can name a whole long list of them here in India. But the Theravadis have preserved the idea that the Acharya will be selected for his leadership skills, for his mind and his ideas and his proactiveness. And this is why the Theravadis have such a bright future. Albeit they are a small group demographically, but they can have a big impact. And in this regard, I want to say a response to the convener, Surendra Patwari, when he challenged us for some kind of idea at the end of the Samroha to actuate. And that is, he came up with the idea, wonderful idea, that at least 11,000 Theravadis should take the vow to not destroy trees. But why not take that a step further and say, okay, we are actually joining a national movement. I mean, there is a national movement in India to preserve the forest and not cut down trees, in spite of the fact there are people who are trying to do that, but to take advantage of the forest in that way. But why not lend yourself to that cause publicly, openly, and in a very strong-willed way, and demonstrate the Theravada commitment to what is basically a national need. It will put you in the spotlight. It will draw attention then to the Anuvrat, for example. So I think that's a first small step, as we keep talking about, but then go immediately to the next step, which is to say we Theravadis have committed ourselves to this national program, and look at us. You know, we are part of the dharma of India. Another thing that I'd like to emphasize is Professor Flugel's point that dharma is for all. And this reverberates in my mind because you know, I'm a scholar I'm a philologist of text. Basically, I read text and interpret them. And I constantly are coming across in giant texts in the medieval period, for example, references to the Apara Dharma Vada, the Apara Dharma Vada. Now, what is that? It is the Jain way of saying the Hindu Dharma. Okay, so the Jains are basically saying that there are dharmas in our land. We happen to be proud of our dharma, our Jain dharma. We support it and so on. But there are other dharmas, and instead of using the word, well, in those days, of course, Hindu was not a word that was in parlance, so they would use this phrase, Apara Dharma. With that, let me launch into what I was going to actually say. It already has been mentioned that I became interested in Jainism through my exposure to India 48 years ago. I was 19 years old and a second-year college student when I came to India. I brought myself to India and studied for 2 semesters at MS University in Baroda. At that time, I was an archaeology student. I ultimately changed my focus to the archaeology of languages instead of the archaeology of material culture. But it changed my life. And when I was 19, I didn't realize it, but I was going to become half Indian. And I would be proud to say today that a couple of weeks ago, I became a person of Indian origin. I have a PIO card now. Thank you. So, which of course suggests that my spouse is Indian citizen, which is correct. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten the card. So that changed my life. It set my life on a track. And as it was mentioned, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Rajasthan, and later I went to graduate school and back to India many times for research. The Jain, we also think of India as an astonishingly rising nation, rising India, right? Well, it's actually deja vu all over again. Economic historians have posited that between 2,000 years ago and up until the 19th century, China and India possessed 50% of the GDP of the world. Many Indians aren't aware of this fact, that they were so wealthy. In 1605, when Jahangir ascended the throne in Delhi after the death of his father, Akbar, he was 10 times more wealthy than James I of England, who had just become king after the death of Queen Elizabeth. 10 times, right? So what happened to India's wealth between 1605 and 1947? What happened was colonialism. And of course, we know the checkered story of that experience. But let me remind you that until 1825, India and China were still holding 50% of the world's wealth. So what happened after 1825? We'll just look at the actions that the British took in India after that time. They basically controlled the economy, right? And they reversed the tables of money flow from, the Europeans came to India, starting with Vasco da Gama in 1498, precisely to get what they wanted from India. They wanted her spices, they wanted her textiles. So they came here, and the Indians said, well, what can you give us in exchange? And they didn't have anything that the Indians wanted to buy. So they basically told the Portuguese and the French and the English, give us some silver and some gold, and that will satisfy our need, which they did do. And basically, for the next 200 years, India drained Europe of its gold and silver reserves. So in the 18th century, the British decided that they had to do something about this. So they had their little incident in Bengal in 1757 at the battle there. And after 1757, the rest is, as they say, history. So India was reduced to 2% of the world's GDP by 1947. It went from 25% to 2%. So what's happening now is basically that India and China are regaining their world positions that they have held for centuries before 1947. The giant contribution to story literature, not only of India, but many parts of the world, have been absorbed, borrowed, and adapted. Their themes have been adapted, even exact elements of such stories. The Jains and the Buddhists, essentially, invented the idea of the story nested within a story. Why? In order to give instruction to sahadus, in order to teach lessons, and to aspiring monks and sadhvis and lay people. And it's an amazing story that the Panchatantra, for example, it traveled through Persia, was translated into Persian and Arabic, and then ultimately is translated into French and German and English. So, you know, the folk stories of the Grimm brothers is essentially an adumberation of the Panchatantra stories. Okay, only 2 minutes left. Oh my God. Okay. Let me transition here to my main point. The ethical questions embedded in the idea of the circular economy are in part ethical questions embedded in the astonishing, if not troubling, increase in the Indian population. This is an important point, and I think even giants in this room need to think about this. It is awesome to think of the responsibility of taking care of the basic needs of an additional 1 million human beings per month. Yes, India adds the equivalent of an Australia every year to her population. It is naive, if not a dangerous proposal, to think that the Indian government is in a position to answer all of the questions and address all of the responsibilities that are implicated in such a demographic storm. Yes, we can take note of and congratulate those individuals like Dr. Male, who have provided demonstrations of how a response can be mounted to the challenges brought about by a burgeoning economy driven by population growth, augmented by increased aspiration for consumable goods. But, and this is an important but, India is a democracy. That is, the people have a major say in how they are governed. No doubt the concept of democracy is a messy one. Not all democracies are the same. A nation state that operates on democratic principles is always a work in progress. Amartya Sen, one of the famous economists who received the Nobel Prize, has suggested that India's democracy is technically a cephocracy. What is a cephocracy? It comes from a Greek word. That is, the central linchpin of India's claim on her democracy is the process of the ballot box. People get to vote. Right? He goes on further to suggest that Indians give over too much power to their political leaders after an election by assuming the politicians will solve their problems. Whereas in reality, the voters should hold the feet of their politicians constantly to the fire, while the voters take responsibility themselves as worker bees in their hive of democracy. I'm not suggesting that Indians are not actively working on their democracy. Demonstrations are brought out almost daily all over India to highlight problems and offer solutions. At this point in time, the problems appear to be huge and daunting. Solutions can and will be found, but it will be the individual Indian putting into daily practice attitudinal changes in the Indian ethos, that is, applying smart, ethical choices in their social, economic, and ecological behavior. Just a few more minutes, I want to talk about an encounter I had with Acharya Tulsiji. This is where certain core principles of Jainism, profoundly augmented and made real by the life and teachings of Acharya Tulsiji, can provide a model for the way forward. Allow me to make a small diversion from my point by way of a personal anecdote. I visited Ladnu in December of 1996 in order to get a first-hand look at a Jain university, especially one that had been given the status as a deemed university by the University Grants Commission. The long, sometimes bumpy car road from Jaipur was swept away from my memory when I saw the campus of Jain Vishwa Bharati, how it seemed to rise out of the desert like a jewel. It shouted, "We mean business. We're out to change the world." A student was assigned to me to take me around. I was introduced to Preksha Dhyan by a young Muni on the rooftop of one of the buildings. I happen to have a photographic memory. I can still see myself receiving instruction from the Muni, who quietly and ever so gently guided me into what I believe was the closest I've ever come to a clairvoyant experience. Through enhanced powers of perception, enabled in me by the Muni, I was looking at myself from outside myself. Before I reached that state, I laid on the roof of the building, eyes closed, completely uninterested in and unaffected by the fly that kept bouncing around my face. Normally I would have, been very bothered by this, but somehow I wasn't bothered by it. I followed the young Muni's reverence for the Acharya. Okay. But then something even more amazing happened. The same Muni brought me to meet Acharya Tulsiji. Upon entering the room where he was seated on a low wooden platform, the atmosphere was heavy with his special presence. I followed the young Muni's reverence for the Acharya and touched my forehead to Acharya Tulsiji's big toe. I learned the meaning of humility that day. By then, Acharya Tulsiji had retired as the head Acharya and appeared to me to be quite old and maybe a little frail. But this impression was swept away by the lucidity and power of his answers to my many questions about Jainism. Here was a man born in 1914 and very much in the moment of 1996. When I heard the details of Acharya Tulsiji's innovations to the concepts embedded in the logic of the classic system of Anuvrat, which actually, he didn't invent, it's centuries old, but he changed it, and to the introduction of the Samani category of mendicant teachers, to name just two innovations, all by the way of a wise decision to enable and empower the Theravadins to face the challenges of modernity, I thought to myself, the Theravadins are very lucky to have such a leader at this time in their history. His decision to name and then install Acharya Mahapragya Ji as head Acharya is another example of the kind of far-sighted leadership, vision, and precociousness that he brought to the Acharyaship. He simply led by example, and that example has given new life with the leadership of Acharya Mahashramanji. And even though I have more to add, I better stop.